Hey Maggie, I have a question for you.
Okay.
Have you ever, in the course of being a TA and teaching and things like that, had a student who you felt like was just kind of lazy, just not
Oh,
into
I
it?
mean, yeah, there are definitely students that like put in the least amount of effort possible. Like they're turning in things at the last minute. They're not asking questions. They're just like doing the bare minimum. And, it is what it is. You're gonna have
Yeah,
students like that.
totally. So, what do you think the clinical diagnosis is for laziness?
I'm not aware of one. Is that a thing?
Actually, it's not a thing. There's no like DSM category for laziness or like there's no kind of clinical definition. It's not really a concept that's helpful to like diagnose because it's just like super vague and it's kind of morally loaded to like, oh, lazy is, like insulting, right?
Right. So the real issue is like motivation, right? The kid who doesn't want to do the work or doesn't care about the work. Is that more like what's happening?
Yeah, motivation is, I think that's a better way of looking at it. But the thing about motivation is that it's not a fixed quantity. Like when we say someone's
Mm,
lazy, we like that's kind of like a character judgment, right? It's like sort of
yeah.
saying something about that person's like inherent personality. But motivation is not a fixed quantity. It's not something that like you either have or you don't. It's something that you can develop and that the brain will produce under the right conditions. So, like a
Okay.
kid who, in some cases, seems lazy is maybe unmotivated, but that doesn't mean that they can't become more motivated if they were in maybe a different environment.
Okay. So I have this thing that I say when people are trying to like explain away their bad choices that an explanation does not equal an excuse. But it sounds like what you're saying is that lazy is not even an explanation. It's just a thing that
Yeah,
people say.
absolutely. It feels like an explanation, like, oh, isn't she doing her homework? It's because she's lazy. It feels like it's an answer, but it's not really. So
Hmm.
today we're going to talk a little bit about what an answer might actually be. Hi, I'm Beth Callahan,
And I'm Maggie Hagen.
and this is High School Wasn't Built for Every Kid. Last episode, we talked about why smart kids struggle. And today, we're going to get more specific. We're going to talk about why the most common explanation for a struggling student that they're lazy is one of the least useful ones. So, we're going to take that apart. So, we want to talk a little bit about what lazy actually is.
It sounds like the way that the label works is that we see a student not doing the work and we make an assumption that it's because they don't want to. And so we call it laziness. But it sounds like our assumption is kind of jumping over the real question, which is what's generating this behavior?
Exactly. Why are they behaving in a way that is what we might call lazy, right?
Hmm.
So their psychologists have a bunch of different ways of kind of describing this, and there's really four things that are helpful for us to think about when we think about the lazy behavior. So, one
Okay.
is that sometimes a student might have a mood or an anxiety disorder. Like most
Hmm.
often, depression is something that, causes people to be super unmotivated. There's also fear of failure. I think we've all encountered people, and then sometimes this is even something that happens to me where I'm afraid that I'm not going to be good at it, so I might as well not do it, right? I think
Yeah,
we
for
talked about that
sure.
a little bit before too, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, exactly. It's easier to just not try and not fail. So then you can say like, well, I didn't try. That's why I didn't do it, right? There's also executive function disorder, which we talked about in the last episode, something like ADHD, where a student is having trouble like actually, getting down to the work. But probably the most interesting for us is this concept of learned helplessness, which is basically a psychological state that happens or develops when a student has tried over and over again, but not succeeded or nothing has changed. So they've made the effort a number of times and they haven't been able to succeed. And so they just stop trying. So we'll talk a little bit about where that concept came from. So in the 60s, there were two researchers, Seligman and Mayer, and they did some work with animal testing. And they discovered that animals that were repeatedly exposed to shocks that they couldn't escape. So they were shocked and they couldn't get away from it.
Mhm.
Later, they failed to escape shocks that they could have avoided, even when the exit was right there, even when they could have avoided it really easily. And they called this learned helplessness. So basically, the animals had tried to escape enough times. I know it's really sad to think about think about the animal tests, but they tried to escape the shock and they couldn't enough times that they just stopped trying, even when they realized that, or even when it was the behavior would have been able to let them escape. So the pattern also translates into schools and to students. So a student tries and fails and tries again and fails again. And eventually they learn that trying's not going to do me any good. So they just stop. And it's not because they're lazy, it's because trying stopped making sense. It wasn't going to work. So why bother? What's interesting, though, is that that pattern persists even when the environment changes. So kids can feel like no matter what they do, nothing's going to change in multiple aspects of their life.
Okay, wow, that's a bummer. Really, really dark place to start out. But
Yeah.
okay, I'm a big analogy gal. So if I were to give a lighter analogy than suffering animals, it's like it's like when kids go to school, they're given a bike. Everybody's given a bike, and some kids the bike fits them well, and they get up and they start going, and like then they just keep cruising. And some kids, to varying degrees, are given a bike that's not the right size for them. It's too big or it's too small, and so they're putting in as much effort as the other kids, but they're
Mm,
not getting the same results because it's not the right size for their body. And they tell their teachers and stuff like, I don't know, I see that everyone else is doing it. I can't, it's not working for me. I'm trying. And it's just,
right.
and the system, instead of saying like, oh, maybe this isn't the right fit, or maybe you are a roller skate kid or like something like that, they just keep
Yeah.
putting them back on this bike that doesn't fit them and telling them to try harder
Yeah.
at this thing, which obviously sucks already. But then they think about potentially going to college, and they look at college and they say everybody there is riding bikes and I'm not a bike person. It's not because they couldn't ride a bike if they were like given the right conditions. It's because they were given the wrong bike and they were told that it was their fault that they couldn't
Yeah.
ride it.
Absolutely. That just try harder thing is like so damaging and frustrating if you are the person for whom, something is just not clicking in that particular environment. Such a good analogy. What makes it even more interesting is that so in the 60s is when Seligman and Mayer, published this work about learned helplessness. And then in 2016, so 50 years later, they published another major paper that took into account like another 50 years of research on cognitive science. And so what they did was they discovered that their original hypothesis was a little bit backwards. It
Mm.
still applies though, and here's where I think it is even more interesting for students. So what they discovered is that it wasn't that the animals or students learned to become passive, that they were sort of originally going to like try to change everything and then they learned not to do that. What they learned is that being passive was the brain's default response. So you actually
Mm.
have to learn that your actions produce outcomes, that your effort matters. It's not that you start out thinking that your effort matters and then you learn to be helpless. It's that you start out helpless and need to learn to become more like active and learn that your choices can make a difference. So we need to be teaching students that their choices and that their effort can make a difference.
I feel like when you started that, I was like, oh, okay, it's not as bad as we think. And then like maybe that's worse. That it's like the most important thing for us to learn in school is that like we have impact on our surroundings and like we have control over our own lives. And instead of teaching the students that, we're teaching them that it's not, there's nothing
Yeah,
you can do. That's
totally. And
just,
What it makes me think of is interesting. It's like kind of surprising that anybody succeeds in school
Yeah.
because everybody needs to learn that their effort is going to produce, a change or a particular outcome. And so if the schools are not really teaching that, what ends up happening is just the kids for whom that particular environment really matches up. Those are the kids who will kind of by default learn that, but everybody else gets kind of left behind. And it's like possibly one of the most important things that we should be teaching kids in order to
Yeah.
allow them to motivate themselves and to, like become productive and not become like kind of helpless. And it's one of the things that we're not teaching at all.
Yeah, it feels like that's one of those things like critical thinking or problem solving that like you're t supposed to learn from like other classes, but like maybe that if that's something that innately we're born without, like that should be something that we're really intentionally doing because
Exactly.
man, in this world, it is really easy to feel like nothing you do matters.
It's
Like
so
that's such an
true.
important thing to learn.
Yeah, to be able to learn how to adapt your environment or to be able to adapt your environment in order to control outcomes is super important. And I think because most kids just get sent to a traditional school, what they learn is like, well, there's particular structures in this world that I can't do anything within those structures. And so I just give up, which is kind of sad.
Man. Okay, okay. I know we talked about this last time, but I feel like I have to bring it up again because it's a sticking point for me. At some point, we have to learn to push through hard things too,
Yeah.
though. So, like, how do we balance the risk of we're solving the problems for them instead of teaching them the skills that they need to persevere?
Yeah, absolutely. It's true. It's a good point because there is a sense in which, and this has always been a thing for me too, like where we have to develop grit and persistence in kids,
Yeah.
right? So that's definitely important. And we have to know that like every subject's not going to be inherently interesting to you. It's not going to be like inherently motivating. So you need to be able to sit in the like boring staff meeting and pay attention, or, like work through these hard things. But I think where the mismatch comes, the problem comes is when students are trying to do those things, they're trying to affect change and they don't
Mm,
succeed. So they're trying to have the grit and yet the more you do it, nothing changes. It kind of reminds
okay.
me of it's not Prometheus, it's Sisyphus, right? Who like
Yeah.
kept pushing like bless Sisyphus because that is like the patron saint of like never giving up even though nothing ever changes. So obviously no one can be like that. At some
Yeah. And they
point.
shouldn't have to be.
Exactly, exactly. So true. So let's talk a little bit about what this idea of like kind of learned helplessness, or as we now know, is like inherent helplessness that doesn't become controllability, how that looks like in real kids and in environments. So research is clear that motivation is not a fixed trait, that we have now decades of data showing that the same types of students who are disengaged or lazy in a traditional school engage really differently in environments that give them more autonomy, more relevance to their lives, and more connections between their efforts and their outcomes. So that is one thing that's clear. And one of the most striking versions of this mismatch is, I think we talked a little bit before about with your brother, like the gifted underachiever. So
Yeah.
clearly smart kids who are
Hmm.
not doing as well as we might anticipate they would do in school. Research estimates that up to 50% of students identified as gifted will underachieve at some point in their school careers, despite their like high, abilities. There was one study that specifically showed that underachieving gifted students in that group, 62% of them met the criteria for clinically significant attention issues. So that kind of, that laziness thing of the executive functioning issues. So those attention issues would be part of an executive function things. And most of them were undiagnosed because kids who are smart often can mask that. They can kind of get by in various ways, but then what happens is once they reach a certain point and school gets like really intense and you've got all these different classes and you're required to do all these different things, your intelligence isn't enough to make up for that traditional structure that may not be helpful for your brain. So that's when, like a lot of times in high school, kids will start really underachieving even though they're gifted. So a smart kid who for a while could kind of get by and coast without having to build any kind of tools, the like self-regulation and study habits and resilience, those kids end up struggling and thinking then, well, all of a sudden you're just lazy. And they become told that they're not smart rather than I just need a different strategy or I need a different environment.
Yeah, this all resonates with my brother a lot in my mind. I've been thinking about since the last episode. I checked with him before we recorded to make sure that that was okay to use him as an example.
Yeah.
And he said something like, well, yeah, no, of course you're allowed to use my story, but like you should know that like I don't think it was really the ADHD. I think I was just a bad student. Like I
Mm.
just didn't want to do my homework and stuff. And I was like, brother, that's the thing. That's what I'm telling you. It is the problem because he said he never wanted to do his homework. And I said, well, what was the function of your homework? And he said, I ask myself that every day. And I said, that's the thing. You shouldn't have to be
Yeah,
asking yourself why you're doing this work. It should make sense why it matters. That's a big part of motivation, I think, right?
absolutely. And
And
that's
I
the
know that
thing.
I
Go ahead.
was just thinking as you were talking about he has done like maintenance handyman stuff like both as his main job and as like side jobs his whole life, and I wonder
Mhm.
how much of that is like there's a problem and I can go in there and I can fix it, and like
Mm.
I can see that I fixed the problem, I can see that I'm
Yeah,
affecting a change. And I know that there's like
absolutely.
there are other factors as well, but like there are definitely situations where I'm like, go for this bigger thing for yourself that I do think in his mind like doesn't see that he deserves that and that he could do that for sure because he believes still at 31 years
Hmm.
old that he was doing poorly in school because he was a bad student, not
Yeah,
because it was a bad
absolutely.
system
Yeah,
for
and
him.
that's the thing that's really hard to undo. Obviously, he is now in his 30s, and the problem is that these students are consistently told you're lazy, but also, from their perspective, the behavior that comes from this mismatch that like the environment was not really conducive to their particular brains being able to engage with the material, that behavior, like not turning in your work and like checking out, it looks like the behavior that would come from someone who is lazy or who generally just doesn't care.
Right.
And so the kids are both being told that they're lazy, but are also seeing in themselves a behavior like your brother was saying, like, I don't know why I didn't turn in my homework. Well,
I
he's
know.
then making, right? Then he's making that assessment that it must be because I'm lazy, because I don't know. And so that label damages that student's, perspective. And it's great that your brother was able to find a situation where he knew that he could affect change. Like he
Mhm.
was smart enough to be able to move himself into an environment that allowed him to have that controllability. It allowed him to do things. But as you point out, like maybe if someone had identified that for him earlier, like he would have had a different trajectory. He might have
Yeah.
been able to pursue something that was really, engaging for him, but that he thought he couldn't do.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess there is like some level where it's good that my brother didn't totally write off his own role in it, right? There has to be like
Yeah.
some again balance, it's the balance of personal accountability with like an explanation's not an excuse. You have to advocate for yourself, which I guess that's part of the thing is that they have learned that advocating for themselves doesn't work. But like, what does that bring up for you? That balance
Yeah,
of
well,
accountability.
for sure. I think there's definitely like we need to teach kids to, be responsible and like we don't want to suggest that like, oh, well, just because this seems boring, we kind of talked about this a little bit before, just because this seems boring, like that's not an excuse for you to like not do it. Um, but to hold them responsible, we also need to give them the ability to achieve. So
Mm,
it's like, we wouldn't give a kid like chemistry homework when they're in like sixth grade and then be like, why aren't you being responsible? Like, why aren't you doing your homework? Like, they literally don't know how to
yeah.
do that homework, right? So you can only hold kids accountable for something like that they can actually do. So, like,
Okay.
if we tell someone to like leave the room and the door is locked from the outside, we're not going to blame them for not leaving the room, right? They don't have the
Right.
ability to get out of the room. But we have to both give them the chance to affect that change and also we have to do it enough times that then they learn that they can affect change, that like that's part of learning how to be responsible is learning that like, okay, if I do this thing, then I am going to be able to succeed or be able to like make a difference. So
Mm,
if we take it back to school, when a student has spent years somewhere that didn't reliably sort of provide them the opportunity to make a difference or to succeed, maybe like grades were just tracking compliance and not really achievement, or the pace moved
mm,
regardless of what they did. Like, no matter how much they did their homework, like the pace was either too slow or was too fast. So that like pathway in their brain that says, my effort makes a difference is just not built. Like they don't
mm,
learn that. So it's not that they're refusing to be responsible, it's that their experience of being able to control things was not really ever there. And so they didn't really ever learn that.
So
So,
instead of teaching them persistence because the persistence does something, we're teaching them not to be persistent, really. Like we're teaching them
exactly.
that there's no use in doing that, so why would you do it at all?
Totally. Yeah, you're absolutely right. We're actually teaching them the literal opposite of what we want them to, what we want to
Okay.
be teaching them.
Good. This
So
is good.
then, yeah, right. So then we can kind of see what the antidote is, right? Is like we need to put students in environments where effort will reliably like make a difference, will make a change so that they can see the connection between what they do and what happens. So there are three things that are often problematic in the traditional high school environment that we can change, usually by putting them in a different environment that
Okay.
will help. So one is, I just mentioned before, pace. So
Mm,
when students can move at their own speed, then they start to see that the effort starts connecting to progress again. So most classrooms, like, they have to kind of teach just right to the middle. So if you're a student who's struggling and is like not, having difficulty understanding the concept, doesn't matter. You just have to like work harder. And even if you work harder, the pace is not going to like go with what your learning needs. So you just learn that, like, well, I mean, no matter what I do, they're still going to keep going fast. And the
hmm.
same thing for we talked about last time too, for students who are gifted, you're it's not going to speed up if you continue to like so why would you bother? Like it's just going to be
Right.
boring for you the whole time, right? So that's
Mm,
one thing is pacing. When students can move at their own speed, their effort starts to make a difference.
okay.
Also engagement. So we talked the last episode about how like the ADHD brain, runs on interest and novelty and challenge, and that's kind of true of everybody too, right? Like the more
Hmm.
interested you are, the more your effort you're going to put in. But kids in the wrong environment, this could mean like no engagement at all. Like there are some kids who are able to like pull through in that particular traditional environment. For other kids, the way that their brains work, it's like if there's not that kind of engagement for them, they're not going to do it at all. And then
Right.
the last thing is like visible progress. So it's not about like praising kids or, oh, you did such a good job. It's more about the kids seeing that they are learning things. I did
Mm.
this and now I have this new skill. So those
Okay.
three things are part of good learning design. But the problem is that traditional high schools cannot provide these three things reliably to all learners because there's just too many kids in the classroom. So,
Yeah, yeah, it feels like scale is a big part of this. Like
yeah,
when you're teaching, like we have a limited number of teachers boy do we not give people good motivation to become more teachers.
absolutely.
But one other thing that sticks out to me is the engagement part. Like some of that is just going to be like science was something that I was really interested in, so I
Mm.
could engage the heck out of that class. But like history was something that was never fun for me. There are some kids that are just like not going to be there's subjects that you have to take that you're just not interested in. Like
Yeah.
not everyone loves algebra. That's not the school's fault. How do you get around that?
Yeah, it reminds me of, well, first of all, I would say that part of it is that interest itself is not necessarily a fixed rate. Like you're not necessarily just not interested in history. Research on
Mm,
how interest develops actually shows that it usually starts kind of situationally, like something in your environment sparked an interest. So like an interesting question or a moment of feeling like you really like understood something like in an interesting way. So it's usually that situational spark. So it reminds me too of when I was in high school, I took physics and I hated it. I absolutely hated it. And I just figured it was a really hard class for me. And a lot of that was because the way it was being taught, I was continually struggling. I didn't have the math at the time that I needed to do this particular
mm.
physics class. And so I was constantly like trying to catch up and learn like basically another discipline at the same time. And so ironically, today, one of the things I love most reading about, like as a layperson, is theoretical physics. I'm so interested. It's like so fascinating to me. But if I had been in that physics class and had been able, like the pacing had been more like, up my alley, and if I had been given an insight into the way in which those concepts could lead me to like think about other things like quantum mechanics and cosmology and things like that, that would have made such a difference to me. But it was
Okay.
just like, do this lab, here's the next thing, get this grade. And it was never like kind of connected to relevance for me. Or so it wasn't that I'm not interested in physics. It was
Okay.
that like physics was not sparked to me. So, I mean, that's not necessarily to say that like every subject is going to be something that you love, but you can, I think, spark interest in kids for subjects that, are maybe not going to be their favorite, but at least is enough to kind of get them through and to see how it's going to help them. So,
Okay. So one thing for me I know that's been helpful when it's something that I'm like not really interested in is real world connections. Like
mm,
if we're talking about something that's like really abstract, it's so hard for my brain to latch onto that and to care about it. But if we can connect it to like this is a way that in my day-to-day life it will actually benefit me to know this.
that's
Is
why
that
you're
a
an
way to
analogy
like
girly.
yes, it is. Is that like a way to trick your brain into caring about the thing because you can see that it's useful in some way?
Yeah, for sure. And it's not even really a trick, It's so I was saying like, if I could see how learning these physics concepts was relevant to my life, it's actually what these real world connections are something that cognitive scientists call utility value. So meaning that that information is valuable because it's useful, because it's like relevant to the real world, right? So it helps you see that this concept is something that I can connect to things that actually matter to me that are in the real world. So, like, if a kid sees how algebra maybe connects to like budgeting their allowance or something like that. And that's why the same subject taught in different ways produces totally different engagement. The kid who zones out in a history class that's like, memorize all these dates and all these battles might be completely absorbed by a history class that talks about like contested interpretations of a particular, historical period. So, but traditional school by design, it can't create sparks for each individual student. It just has to like, again, teach to the middle.
Yeah, that feels like the scale issue again. Like,
yeah, exactly.
It sounds great in theory, but a teacher can't personalize the lesson to every student in the classroom. That's just not realistic.
Yeah, absolutely. That level of like individualization would almost require a teacher for every student, or at least a teacher to like, know each student so well and then adapt their curriculum to each student. So that's like impossible, right? But that's changing a little bit because there are now tools that exist to personalize learning at scale in ways that we really couldn't even imagine years ago. And we'll talk about that in the next episode.
Okay, cool.
So now we know that calling a kid lazy does not tell you why they're doing what they're doing or why they're not doing what they should be doing. So the real question we should be asking is what is generating the lazy behavior? And most of the time, the answer is something that we can fix. And it's usually not the kid that we need to fix. It's usually the environment that we need to fix. So next episode, we'll get very concrete. We'll look at what it actually means to fix the environment, to redesign it so that it works for the kid. And we'll see what happens to a kid who's been called a bad student for years once you put them somewhere that's actually built for how they learn. So find us at collegeonramps.org. And if you've had the lazy conversation about your kid, maybe this is an episode to share with some other people. We'll see you next time.
Send it to your kid's teacher.
Exactly. Send it to your kid's teacher for sure. All right, we're out.